Why?
Meet OrphanRed, self-proclaimed flat earther, Mensa member, and anti-scientist. Okay, she's here to unlock the mysteries of the universe. Looking through her videos, she has quite the history of disproving widely accepted knowledge and showing how the vast majority of people are NPCs living a lie. Unfortunately, it's all a load of baloney. Today we'll be discussing one of her many attempts at disproving science, namely the Cassini Conundrum.
Most people just assume that Cassini sent back JPEG-type images to NASA from Saturn, and so that somehow the Cassini was a lot like the camera that I'm using now.
Which it is. The imaging science subsystem on the Cassini spacecraft consists of two CCD cameras, one for wide-angle shots and one for narrow-angle shots. Without going into too much detail, a CCD, or charge-coupled device, is an integrated circuit that relies on the photoelectric effect. When a photon comes into contact with a CCD pixel, the photon is absorbed and an electron is released. The free electrons are then attracted by a positively charged capacitor and are collected.
And it was just snapping pictures and sending like an email through the vastness of space, JPEG images. And then the NASA scientists were just opening the email, downloading the image, and there we go, that's Saturn. Except that's not how it worked.
Yep, that's not how that works.
But here is a crucial factor that's required for an image to be formed in a camera that NASA is curiously not addressing. You're a citizen of the world, and as a citizen of the world, you have a responsibility to make sure that knowledge is valued and truth is...
Okay, just get to the point, please.
The standard.
I'm begging you.
So here's the problem. In order for a camera to take a picture, the light has to fall onto the sensors in such a way as to form an image. And in order to do that, it has to be consciously observed. It has to be observed by a conscious being. Do you see where the problem lies here?
Okay, let's all relax. There's a lot to unpack here. Let's just let her finish. She is a Mensa member after all. I'm sure she's getting somewhere.
Then those photons are going to maintain their probability distribution state. They're not going to collapse into particles. So they're not going to form an image on the sensor in the Cassini. It's just going to be interference patterns. The properties of the individual photons are maintained in a superposition state. So the properties of each photons aren't fixed or are set. They're just a superposition state of all possible property values all at the same time. So it's just, do you see? Some of you will see.
Does an observer have to be conscious in order to collapse a wave function? No, probably not. This misconception is thought to have been a result of the double-slit experiment, which demonstrated some of the most interesting properties of quantum mechanics and seems to be the main experiment OrphanRed is misinterpreting. The double-slit experiment was a major experiment in the foundations of quantum mechanics. If we shine a laser into a double slit, you produce an interference pattern. The same occurs for a beam of electrons, which are classically thought of as particles and shouldn't produce an interference pattern. This is one of the major examples of wave-particle duality. However, say we attach some sort of electrical sensor to each of the slits that allows us to determine which slit the electrons are passing through. Doing this ends up breaking the interference pattern. The Copenhagen Interpretation explains that electrons travel as an abstract wave function, a probability wave that defines the location of the particle at any point, but only if we try to measure it. Before this experiment, the electron exists as its wave function. Measuring which slit the electrons travel through therefore collapses the wave function and produces a coherent source at the detecting screen, rather than an interference pattern. But where exactly does the transition between the quantum and the classical world occur? OrphanRed seems to be agreeing with the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation of quantum mechanics, which suggests that to collapse a wave function, you need a conscious observer to do so. This idea was first suggested by John von Neumann in his book The Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics in 1932, and was actually the standard interpretation for some time. However, the idea that the conscious mind can affect reality has caused a bit of a societal ruckus in recent times, from ideas like quantum mysticism and general other forms of quackery becoming widespread in modern-day society. There are a lot of critiques to this interpretation, even some by former supporters, and the interpretation is no longer accepted as the general model. A notable critique comes from David Bohm and Basil J. Hilly, who wrote that it is difficult to believe that the evolution of the universe before the appearance of human beings depended fundamentally on the human mind. In other words, assuming that humans and some animals are the only forms of conscious minds in the entirety of the universe would have had to evolve for billions of years without the existence of humans, and thus without wave function collapse. They further wrote that, of course, one could avoid this difficulty by assuming a universal mind, but if we know little about the human mind, we know a great deal less about the existence of a universal mind. Such an assumption replaces one mystery by an even greater one. It's also important to note that not just any photon can produce an interference pattern. An interference pattern can only be generated by light with large spatial coherence, such as light from a laser onto a double slit. Light from the sun reflecting off of a planet has very little spatial coherence, like a flashlight, and is thus unable to produce an interference pattern in most cases. The lens on the Cassini spacecraft is also not at all like a double slit. Shining a coherent source like a laser into a camera lens does not produce an interference pattern in the first place. So regardless of whether or not we have some sort of conscious observer floating around Cassini at all times of the day really didn't matter. The photons will hit the CCD, the photoelectric effect will take place, the electrons will be collected, etc. and etc. It's like how the saying goes, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Yes. Yes, it does. It does. It does. Let's humor her argument a little bit though. Supposing that an interference pattern does show up on the CCD and no discernible image is formed, what does she think is going to happen next? Let's take a look.
Possibility number 1. NASA is lying to you.
I really should have seen that coming.
Probability number 2. The act of the first person at NASA to open the image file that the computer has created from digital data, from ones and zeros, somehow affects the past and collapses them into photons in the past. Yes.
Okay, so here's the crazy thing. I kinda get what she's trying to say. Just a little bit. She's talking about the idea of retrocausality, which is related to things like delayed choice and quantum eraser experiments. She mentions these again in the comments section multiple times, using the same copy and pasted argument to try and disprove some poor fellows who accidentally stumbled upon this amalgamation against mankind. The funny thing is that she directly cites 2 different papers on the topic in these comments, which completely goes against her own anti-scientific morals. What's even more confusing in this case is that she seems to agree with the idea that the act of observing the final image is what creates the image in the first place. In her words, the info is overlaid onto the past, according to the current model in physics. This seems to be playing off the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation once again, such as the act of observing the image is what collapses the wave function in the first place. However, delaying this observation somehow affects the wave function of the photons in the past. So, in her eyes, if I were to place a camera in an isolated environment with no conscious observer to meddle with the wave function, took a picture using a remote after leaving, then came back 3 days later, the act of opening the image on the camera would collapse the wave function of the photons that hit the CCD 3 days ago. What? So, the delayed choice quantum eraser is a modified version of the double-slit experiment. It uses a crystal to split photons into 2 photons of equal energies. These 2 photons are twins of each other and are called an entangled pair. They're connected in strange ways that we don't fully understand just yet. If we send one of each pair to the interference screen and the other to a separate detector that confirms which slit the photon passed through before it being split, the result is a collapsed wave function. No interference pattern is produced. This brings up the idea of retrocausality. Are the photons that are being detected somehow affecting the wave function of the photons that hit the interference screen in the past? Believe it or not, it gets even more complicated by introducing the quantum eraser. This device uses a beam splitter that reflects only 50% of the incoming photons. Photons that pass through each end up in one of 2 different detectors. This ensures that we don't know which slit these photons came through. Looking at the entangled pair of the photons that are scrambled by the eraser produces an interference pattern, while if we look at the ones that were detected by the original detectors, we once again get a collapsed wave function pattern. This is a whole jumble of confusion, but the solution may lie within the ideas of quantum entanglement itself, such that the non-locality of the photons does not violate causality. I actually read both the papers that OrphanRed uses in her arguments. Notably, the one reproducing the delayed choice experiment with a heavy atom does not offer retrocausality as the only solution, but rather suggests that a classical interpretation cannot be applied. The general consensus is that it should never be possible to violate causality. A paper by Eberhardt and Ross argues that if the accepted equations on quantum field theory are correct, faster-than-light travel should be impossible and causality cannot be broken. However, some physicists believe that an experimental retrocausality and instantaneous communication could in fact be possible. Long story short, there is a lot more we have to do in order to fully understand what is going on in these experiments. Here's the thing, we can talk about quantum erasers and retrocausality all day if we wanted, but the issue is that none of this is related to CCD imaging. At all, pretty much. As stated previously, consciousness is not thought to be a requirement to collapse a wave function. Attempting to cite a complex scientific experiment to prove a pseudoscience is the equivalency of me claiming that the government is run by reptilian overlords, with my sole piece of evidence being the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This whole video just perplexes me. She clearly has a decent understanding of quantum mechanics, but is taking these theories and mingling them together in ways that do not make sense. At the end of the day, entangled particles and retrocausality and what is the equivalency of time travel should not be affecting the taking of an image in an isolated environment. Hey, so I was going to end this video with a really funny sketch of how the universe collapses because, oh no, she was right and photons have to be consciously observed or something like that. But my camera broke and I'm also very running out of time, so instead here's a gif of spitting food that I found on my computer drive. Have a good day.